Okay, Deirdre, well, let's talk executive pay. House Financial Services Committee Chairman Barney Frank is moving forward today with his bill to give shareholders a non-binding vote on executive pay and also to require company boards' compensation committees to have more independence. Chairman Frank joins us now from Capitol Hill with Peter Cook. Peter.
Betty, thanks very much. Joined now by Chairman Frank, the House Financial Services. Mr. Chairman, thanks for the time. You're beginning the heavy lift, putting together the regulatory reform package today. The vote, the focus in your committee is on executive pay. I want to ask you, if your bill becomes law today, do you think pay in the financial sector in particular is going to come down?
I think it probably will in bad times, and I think that's the experience we have here in England. You know, people talk about, oh, is America going to be a competitive disadvantage? But this is a case where the model we're talking about for the overall amount, the one that we think will affect the overall amount, that's the say on pay. The English have had that for several years, and the experience was that most of the, I think all but one of the packages were approved by the shareholders, this allows the shareholders to vote, until things started going bad. And the shareholders said, wait a minute, we want to pay you good money in good times, but in bad times, we think you're getting paid too much. So recently in England, there have been some negatives. And yes, some salaries, some compensation packages have come down. So I think what it will mean is that the compensation is more likely to track the broad outlines in the economy.
Say on pay, the shareholder vote, that's passed the House before. So let me ask you about some of the more controversial parts, the newer parts of this that deal more with the regulatory reform side, trying to induce or reduce risk-taking in the financial sector by tying pay to it. For those people who say the government has no role here at all, you say what?
Well, let me be very careful about what we want to do. What we're going to be proposing is guidance on executive compensation will clarify that compensation packages should be structured in such a way as to tie reward to performance and that they don't create excessive amounts of risk for the firm. By the way, that was Ben Bernanke. I was reading it because that's what Chairman Bernanke has said. That's what Paul Volcker has said. In other words, it is not politicians who are angry, responding to public anger. The people who have most dispassionately analyzed what got this economy into trouble have almost unanimously concluded that excessive risk-taking by corporate executives was part of the problem because they were paid to take excessive risk. And what we're telling the SEC is, in this part of it, we're not talking about amounts. It'll be up to the shareholders. If the shareholders think $1 trillion is enough, they can vote for it. What we're saying is, do not, however you pay the overall amount, the government says, don't have a system which makes you take excessive risk. And because that's what happened and in part how we got into trouble. So yeah, I think it's appropriate for the government to say, we don't want systemic influences that will cause us problems.
Who in the government's going to decide what's excessive, what's not?
The Securities and Exchange Commission. But they will have the guidance, for instance, of the Federal Reserve, hardly a radical body. Chairman Bernanke, when he testified before us last week, mentioned that the Federal Reserve is planning recommendations about how to do this. Now, the trouble is that today they're just recommendations without force. Or it's unclear if they have force on banks. And they might apply to banks and not other financial companies. They wouldn't apply to an AIG, say. We're going to give the SEC the authority, in effect, to take the guidelines, the recommendations, more than guidelines, that the Federal Reserve is developing and apply them.
So if I'm a Wall Street banker right now and I got a bonus or expect a bonus this year, what's going to happen to it in the future?
If the bonus was tied to performance in a reasonable way, if it depended on the longer term, by longer term we mean perhaps a year, not 6 months, and if it was a two-way thing where you made money if your activity made money, but you suffered some penalty if you blew up the building, then nothing would happen. By the way, I do want to raise this question when some of the top people tell us about their bonuses. If you're the head of J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, any of these major institutions, what is it about your character that says, yes, you're highly paid to run a very important organization, but to make sure that you do your job right, that you really worry about doing it right, we have to give you an extra bonus. Most of us do our jobs without getting extra bonuses. If they want to do that, that's okay. But we are saying, yeah, if you've got a bonus which says, look, I'm going to take this big risk, and if it pays off, I bring home a lot of money. But if it damages the country, the economy, the business, I don't lose anything, those we're going to ban.
From what you understand of a bank like Goldman Sachs right now that's not under the TARP restrictions, would its pay structure have to change as a result of this?
I would have to look at it. Again, there are two things here. The shareholders would decide whether or not it was too much. The federal government, under the bill we are, I hope, going to pass, won't talk about amounts. That'll be up to the shareholders. One of the companies, 72% of the revenue is going to compensation. The shareholders think that's okay. That's okay. As to the Goldman or any of the others, it would depend on how it was structured. If we go back to the way it used to be, where they got bonuses if a bet paid off and lost nothing if the bet blew up, yeah, then they would have to change that. This part doesn't reduce or limit the overall amount. It simply says there has to be some congruence between risks and failures.
You know, there's already an argument being made out there. Top talent's going to leave, go to foreign banks instead because of exactly this kind of thing.
As I pointed out, that is a silly argument because in the first place, on say on pay, we're borrowing that from England. We have had conversations with the British, with the European Union. The fact is they want to play off against each other. That, by the way, is more likely to be the case now. There are no rules. So if you are a board that sets pay and you want to limit some of these excesses, then people may say, I'll go elsewhere, although they rarely do. What we're trying to do, and I believe we'll succeed, is the European Union, the United Kingdom, which is sort of a subset there with some autonomy, Canada, Japan, we're going to have a coordinated set of rules. And I think you're going to see the kind of rules we are adopting to reduce risk incentives internationally adopted. That's not what they want. They want the money. In fact, we are going to be taking the lead in putting a set of rules in place that will protect them against unfair competition of that sort more than they are today.
All right, this is one leg, one plank of the overall regulatory reform effort. You said yesterday you think that's going to probably pass in the fall, be signed into law by the president. What's the heavy lift? What of the remaining outstanding issues are the toughest?
Well, there are a couple of intellectual issues. There was general agreement that we need some entity regulating for systemic risk, telling an AIG or somebody else, you are way over leveraged. You've got to raise much more capital. Who does that is a difficult issue. There was an initial view, which I share, that it should be the Federal Reserve. There's a lot of resistance to that, and frankly, politically, it's clear that's not going to happen. There's going to be some combination of existing regulators working together. Now, you want to have a council so people don't think there'll be abuses, but it's got to have enough ability to move. Secondly, on derivatives, there's an overwhelming consensus that derivatives in the Congress and the administration, most of them have to go on exchanges or clearinghouses. But not every single one can. How do you deal with that? Do you ban naked credit default swaps, or do you greatly increase the capital for those that are there? So there are a couple of intellectual questions within a framework of agreement.
Really, one final question, if I could sneak it in here. Different topic. The Gates situation, your home state of Massachusetts. Did the president make a mistake there?
Oh, I didn't follow it all very closely. I think that well, let me put it this way. The president has said what he wanted to say about it. And I think what he did was very reasonable to try and defuse this situation. But I've been pretty busy with this. I did comment that I would say there's one important thing. To the extent that part of the problem was that people thought Professor Gates was being disrespectful, people yell at me a lot. I think the right to yell at people in authority is a very important American democracy. So I wouldn't want anybody, of course, if you're disruptive, if you're threatening, that's a problem. But the right to yell at authority figures is, I think, a very important First Amendment right that ought to be protected.
All right, Mr. Chairman, thanks for the time. We appreciate it, as always. Chairman Barney Frank, the House Financial Services. Deirdre, that markup getting set to begin here on Capitol Hill.
Peter, thanks so much.